Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This week I am here to talk to you about books again. We've got our cup of tea, we've got sort of like a rainy day outside, so I think it's the perfect time to be talking to you guys about all the books I've read so far in 2025. Basically the 7 books that I read from January through March. I don't want to keep y'all waiting too long, so I'm just going to get started, but before that, some people have been asking for my Goodreads, and I kind of don't use Goodreads anymore, but I do have a Storygraph account. Although I don't really go into detailed reviews there, you can sort of follow along what I'm currently reading, what's on my TBR sometimes, and things like that. So if you're interested in that, I'll put the link in my description. But the first book we have is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, translated by Roz Schwartz. This is a speculative fiction novel translated from French where a group of women are sort of locked in a bunker underground, and the main narrator is quite young, and so she doesn't actually remember a time before that, and so she quite literally has not known men because there are only women in this bunker. And I don't want to spoil anything about this novel because it does get pretty interesting and takes a lot of turns, but essentially the rest of the book is about them sort of learning more about how they ended up there and also learning to sort of depend on each other for companionship and survival. And by the end it becomes sort of like this wild ride that you probably didn't expect. I feel like most of you guys might have seen this book before. It's been getting a lot of hype, and I actually think it, rightfully so, it's probably one of the most sort of like unique, strange speculative fiction works I've read in a long time, and it in some ways it feels extremely French. And the reason I say that is actually a pro I thought of this book, which is that unlike a lot of speculative fiction books, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. In some ways it could feel frustrating, but I think it works for this book because it's not just about exploring this world that has been created, but more about the characters and exploring their psyches and sort of their relationships. And so even though I think some readers might be dissatisfied if you're like used to getting everything sort of like tied up in a nice knot and understanding the roots of everything in a speculative novel, I thought the way it was written and its premise is really special and definitely worth reading. I think it'll stick with me for a long time, even though it's not necessarily the most satisfying book I've ever read, if that makes sense. It's also quite short and a pretty quick read, and so if you're looking for something kind of intense, interesting, just a world that you can lose yourself in for a little bit, that goes by pretty fast, I definitely recommend this one. Next we have Native Speaker by Chang-Rae Lee, and I think this was Chang-Rae Lee's debut novel. It was published in 1995, and it's about the main character Henry Park, who is a Korean American who kind of works as an undercover agent, essentially a spy, and it's about him sort of reconciling and dealing with his Korean identity as well as the relationship with his white American wife that is sort of like complex and strained. And the book really starts when Henry is assigned to spy on a Korean American politician, and which leads him to have a lot of conflicted feelings about his identity. And it becomes sort of a reflection about wanting to fit in and conform, but also feel solidarity and sort of like, where is the line? Where do you decide like who to side with? I feel like all those questions are very central to sort of like the Asian American experience and Asian American history. And so that being said, I think I'm really grateful for this book's existence. I know Chang-Rae Lee has done a lot in terms of Korean American literature and was one of the earliest voices to sort of be talking about these issues. But I feel like in the end, the book still fell a little bit flat for me. The writing was pretty good, but the characters didn't feel super like likable or relatable, and also I think the questions that were being explored in the book to me feel a little bit dated. It just feels like a more simplistic, maybe more 90s understanding of Asian American identity than some of the Asian writers that are writing now. So I think I'd recommend this book if you're interested in Asian American history and sort of tracking the experience across decades, and also Asian American literature. I feel like it is definitely a classic for a reason, but at the same time, on its own, I wouldn't say it's necessarily one of my favorites. The next book is The Years by Annie Ernaux, translated by Alison L. Strayer, and I'm guessing you guys have heard me talk about this if you've watched any of my sort of like week in the life vlogs from the past month. This book is the one physical copy I actually own, but I've lent it to my boyfriend because I loved it so much, so he has it right now. It's essentially a type of memoir that covers 60 years in Annie Ernaux's life and also in French history, but it doesn't read like a standard memoir. There's not really an I, it's more about a we, and so it's kind of like a long sweeping portrayal of the time, the changing culture, as well as her change within herself, her coming of age and getting married, divorcing, facing different challenges in her career, etc., all put next to sort of like the changing culture and beliefs of the time as she goes from, I think it's like 1940 to 2000 maybe, which is a very, obviously like time of a ton of change in French history and also in world history. This book absolutely blew me away. It's some of the best writing I've ever read, probably some of the best translation I've ever read. The way that Ernaud sort of zooms in and out of extremely personal moments, but also huge like socio-political currents of the time is really so impressive and so amazing. It feels very readable and digestible because it's not really one huge narrative. Instead, I feel like it's a really great example of how the personal is political, and how the two connect. This book made me think a lot about sort of how history actually just really is cycling on itself, and the preciousness of sort of logging these moments that will one day become history, even though they feel very mundane and like everyday in our lives now. And honestly, I think she's given me a new goal of mine, which is like to write anything that sort of feels like this, that is able to convey so much of a world that she lived in. And there's also a lot of like sort of sharp lines and sayings and sort of beliefs about growing up, about changing, especially as a woman. And overall, the book just felt like this really beautiful journey that I loved from the first page to the last. And the next book that I read that I also briefly mentioned in one of my vlogs is Kairos by Jenny Eprenbeck, translated by Michael Hoffman. This is essentially sort of like the twisted love story between a man in his 50s and a girl who is like 19, I believe, when the affair starts. And it's set in East Berlin in East Germany during like sort of the tumultuous political time. And we kind of see the government sort of unravel and fall to pieces as the book goes on. My feelings are really mixed about this one. I talked about this in the vlog, but I just think the age gap was so uncomfortable and I just like really did not love reading about it. I also don't really understand why they were together. I think that's like a very crucial aspect, not just the age gap, but even just in the depiction of the characters. I didn't really see what she saw in him and like why she was in this relationship, whereas for him, he's obviously just sort of like a predator, and so I just like really did not love that aspect of it. The writing, on the other hand, there are elements that were really, really beautiful and really unique. And I think the translation was really great. It won the Booker International Prize, so I think, it was probably pretty warranted. But I think I should be honest here and say that I'm not super knowledgeable about sort of the background of East Germany, because I think the relationship was a metaphor for sort of like the old regime holding on to sort of like this new young generation that was gonna see a lot of things change. And I think if you understand it that way, the relationship metaphor is really interesting because it shows how sort of intimately and oppressively the government was involved in these people's lives in East Germany. And then it also works to show sort of how a lot was gained, but also there is a feeling of loss and of sort of like trauma and of not knowing what to do from now on when the government falls, which I don't think that a lot of people have talked about. When it comes to sort of regimes falling, we don't necessarily talk about how it is a loss of a world in some ways, no matter how sort of like destructive that government was. So yeah, I think I did more searching about like sort of the GDR while reading this, and it helped me understand sort of the significance of this work, understanding the Stasi, for example, and sort of the history there. So I think that was really effective, but at the same time, I can't get over the age gap, and I think even though it was a metaphor and it really worked, I think as a book itself, did I necessarily enjoy it? Maybe less so. Do I think it's worth reading? Maybe for the historical aspect and for the experimental thing that she's trying to do with this relationship as a metaphor? Probably. So if you're interested in that stuff, I would definitely recommend it. Just, keep in mind that you're getting into a little bit of a strange relationship, a problematic relationship. Next, we have Chilean Poet by Alejandro Zambra, and this one's translated by Megan McDowell. This is a contemporary Chilean novel, and it's essentially about the relationship between a stepfather and his stepson, and sort of the love and friendship and bond that they form, despite sort of like this strange informal relationship, because he's actually his mother's boyfriend. He's not necessarily like in a formal way the boy's caretaker, and yet he feels a lot of love for him, and there's so much love between them. And also, like the title sort of hints at, it talks a lot about poetry. The stepfather is a poet and the stepson becomes a poet, and so poetry is very much at the heart of this. Like, what does it mean to be a poet in contemporary Chile. What does it mean to be a Chilean poet when a lot of people in the country take pride in poetry and stuff? So I thought that was really interesting. But more than that, I just loved this book so much because the characters felt so incredibly real, and this relationship, I was so invested in the love between these two figures of the stepfather and the stepson. That relationship itself is so touching and so pure and beautiful, and yet the writing overall is very kind of like funny, wacky, a little bit satirical at times, and so it doesn't feel like too like mushy, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think overall the book just flew by because I was really invested in these two characters and seeing how they sort of connect with each other, and I think it was worth it just to see that beautiful ending. The whole book was so cool, but that ending was so beautiful it almost made me cry. And yeah, I feel like the explanation is not doing it justice, but if you want sort of like a heartwarming but also interesting and funny and kind of sharp read, I would definitely recommend it. This is like the kind of book that I'm so glad translation exists for, because how would I have found it otherwise? The next book a lot of people recommended to me on this channel, and it's The Door by Magda Sabo, translated by Len Rix. This is a Hungarian novel that focuses on the relationship between the narrator, who is sort of like a writer-scholar in her maybe like 40s or something, and her housekeeper or sort of caretaker, Emerence, who is like an elderly woman who is very quirky and has a lot of requirements and is very strict but also incredibly capable. And so what happens is that the narrator kind of becomes physically dependent on her and then a little bit more emotionally dependent, and their relationship becomes extremely complex and interesting. And I think it's also working across sort of like power dynamics of differences in age, differences in class, and obviously of like one employing the other. This was actually such a wild read. I found it very entertaining. I don't think I've read anything like it before, and the character of Emerence was very like sharp to me. She'll stay with me for I think a long time. She's just such a sort of visceral, like energetic character. And for those of you who've read it, I think the title and like what the door comes to mean is also really cool. But the only thing is I do think I had really high expectations. This book was compared to Claudia Piñeiro's work in some of the recommendations to me, and I don't think it quite fits that bill. It might be a translation thing, it might be a writing thing, but I felt like in Elena Knows and Time of the Flies, the relationships are a lot more natural, and sort of the crazy events that happen within those books feel sort of inevitable, and they like all tie together really nicely at the end in sort of like this mind-blowing way where you can tell the author just like really knew how all of these threads were going to combine. With The Door, I think it's a little bit more simplistic in my opinion. I felt like the sort of comparison of these two women was still really interesting, but not done in the same sort of like sweeping way that Piñeiro does it, where you're like, how did she even think of that? This one felt a little bit more like this is really intense and interesting and entertaining, but I don't think it's like blowing me away with what the book is saying, if that makes sense. So if you want just like a really cool fresh read with a really interesting character at the center of it, I would recommend it. But again, I don't think it like lived up to my expectations, my Piñeiro standard. And my last book on the list is Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. This is from my new school library, and for some reason they take off all the beautiful covers and it's just like these black books, which is a shame. But anyways, I read this one in physical copy. This is Tommy Orange's second full-length novel, I believe. I really enjoyed There when it came out, and I know it's incredibly popular, so I think he really deserves his place as sort of like one of the great writers of our time. I actually read this book in two sort of chunks. I read the first half, and then my like library loan sort of ran out or whatever, and so I gave up, and then I decided to try it again after talking with Nathan from Nathan's Nook about it, because he enjoyed it, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna finish this book. And I'm so glad I did, because actually that is the turning point for the book, and my opinion about the book changed around just like the halfway mark as well. Essentially in the first half, each chapter is told from a different character in a sort of multi-generational narrative, so each generation gets one chapter, and it starts in like the 1800s and goes all the way to like maybe the 1950s, following a Native American family who are the descendants of a man who was unjustly imprisoned as like a prisoner of war, and then like sort of experimented on in the sense of like in terms of the so-called like educational policies of the time, where they were essentially stripping Native American culture, language, community and just sort of like the fiber of that life in these schools that would later form. So it starts from that point in history and kind of shows how the trauma of that sort of lingers in each generation and continues developing depending on like, you know, their changing environments and stuff. But the second half focuses on one single family, a couple of characters there, and focuses a lot more on the experience of addiction in sort of like our contemporary now. And I thought that second half was a lot more interesting to read, and I really, really loved the characters there. Tommy Orange is just such a good writer, so the whole thing is incredibly just beautifully written. But the first half, even though it had sort of like intended sweeping effect, I think I just didn't feel that connected to any of the characters, and so I was kind of like slogging. I was like, okay, when are we going to get someone that we like? And then the second half is when we really get sort of this cast of characters that I think anyone would sort of fall in love with and root for. The only last thing is that I also felt like the end was a little bit rushed, and like he just kind of wrapped up all these threads all of a sudden. But I love these characters enough that I honestly would forgive that. I think the book was still really great, and even just to experience his writing and sort of like that family at the end, I think it's really worth it, and it's a really cool experimental work in terms of the structure, even though I don't know if it fully worked for me as a reader. And as you can probably tell, this was like my first sort of contemporary American lit book of the year, and I'm so glad I finished it because it sort of reminded me why I used to really love and still do love contemporary writers and contemporary books. They are the ones who are sort of pushing the English language and the sort of American literature now. So I think this just inspired me to read more of them, because if you guys have been here for a while, you'll know that I've kind of gotten sick of the MFA contemporary American lit style writing, but there are some gems out there, and Tommy Orange is definitely one of them. So yeah, it's been a while since I've read There. I think I enjoyed it more than this one, but honestly, either of them I would recommend. Yeah, really great way to end off the month. So I think those are all the books for this reading wrap up. I hope you enjoyed sort of like, you know, my tour of all the books that I've read in the past 3 months. Even though 7 books in 3 months could seem a little slow, especially for someone on BookTube, I think it's been a really good reading year. Like, I've genuinely enjoyed all of these books and gotten something from them, and felt very like inspired and invested in them, even if I wouldn't like consider some of them my favorites. So yeah, I hope you got some recommendations from this list. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books recently or are excited to read them, or if you have some reads from the past, you know, 3 months or so that you would recommend that I tackle in the next part of the year. As always, I'm sort of just reading whatever I feel like, whatever shows up in my hands, and so right now I'm reading Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, and that's been pretty good so far. Very bleak though, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I'll keep you guys of course updated on any of my reads in the upcoming vlogs, and I'll do sort of like a reading wrap up the next time I have a good sizable list. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you soon with a new video. Thanks for watching. Bye!